Okay, so I'm going to attempt to respond to this respectively and seriously, and like take his response as a genuine, serious response with regards to the Odyssey and Nolan and what his comments were on it. I'm going to try to take this and then possibly in this conversation also add a whole bunch of other kind of like statements that they have made. Like Lupita has also made certain statements, and it's kind of funny to hear these things because it kind of goes to show that first of all, their arguments or their excuses, they kind of contradict themselves in a lot of different ways. They are moving the focal point to something different always, constantly and continuously. And some of the response that they make also kind of makes it obvious that they have no idea what they're talking about because they haven't actually, seen the material they're working on. They don't know anything about it, obviously. So let's go into, looking at this response. We'll start here and we'll go from there. So the first quote, there's a lot of elevating it because it's old. Okay, now this doesn't make any sense at all in the first place. He is at this point trying to say that the only reason why we have elevated the Odyssey is because it's old, which is not true. It's the quality of a work that actually elevates it, and that is what makes it stand the test of time, rather than whether it's old or not, because there's a whole bunch of other cultural, influences and cultural stories and laws and so many stuff that haven't had as much influence, or they haven't been as much elevated because their quality is significantly either lower or not as important, or whatever the case may be. The elevating it because it's old is something that's completely pointless here. It doesn't make any sense. From what I understand, it's mostly kind of like going together with his statement with regards to the language, that we're elevating it, that it sounds more like, elevated formal English. So he's talking more on that perspective. So again, he's ignoring the elephant in the room, and he's talking about completely irrelevant stuff. He's talking about his choice of language, which is like the least important in the entire backlash that the Odyssey has received. That's the least important part, but whatever. Let's just say that he wants to focus on that point. So with regards to that point there, I think what he's trying to say is that, we elevate the language used as if it's, something, more formal and so on and so forth, because it's old. That's one way of looking at it. Another way you could say that subconsciously it's also trying to say that the only reason why the Odyssey is, elevated so much is because it's old, which is not true. Like, the reason why the Odyssey has been elevated is, again, because of its quality. And then we'll go into the next quote here that says, do away with cultural prejudice. He wanted to do away with cultural prejudice around how we view the ancient world. There is no cultural prejudice with how we see the ancient world. There is information and findings and data, and then there is some cultural prejudice with regards to how we view the ancient world based on some of the remnants of those findings. I'll give you one example for this. The fact that we have a lot of the impression that we have that is a lot of the ancient Hellenic temples and statues were all white marble. Now that is kind of a cultural prejudice, you might say, to a certain degree. More so an architectural prejudice of how we view that ancient world, because we don't actually see it with the full colors and so on and so forth. And the reason why is because we're used to seeing all those white marble kind of architectures and statues everywhere. It has been subconsciously kind of imprinted into our psyche with regards to how we view, as you say, ancient Hellas. You think of, or ancient Rome, you think of, okay, it's all white marble and stuff like that. So that is one kind of the prejudices that I could actually say, that I could actually argue. Yes, there is to a certain degree, but for the most part, there are a lot of people that are backlashing and they're against this because they actually have a historical preference with regards to how it was written and how the information has been passed down and what we know. So this is a very kind of that second statement there is very cheeky, I would say, very cheeky and very sly. It's a very sly way of telling us that you don't really know what the ancient Hellenic world was like, when that's not actually true. We do know what the ancient Hellenic world was like. We have actual findings, we have actual art, we have actual architecture, we have actual descriptions, and we have the actual language as well, and we know how they talked, and we know how they would communicate with each other to a certain degree. So our prejudice there around how we view the ancient world, not precisely kind of making that much sense. It's kind of like an excuse at this point that it's tacked on to trying to say that, you know what, it wasn't exactly how we see it. Yeah, it's not exactly how we see it, but it's not so far off either. What he's doing with these two argument points here is he's trying to create an excuse of, you know what, it's different to what you think it is. So because it's different, even if it's like 20% different or 50% different, depending on who you ask, like if you have someone like Metatron, or if you have someone like me, what my perception was and my cultural prejudice of what I would think or how I would view the ancient world, it would be more like 10% wrong compared to what it actually was, and our perception of it would be much more accurate because we're much more, kind of like, historical students or whatever the case may be. He's more of a historical student to the degree that he does it for a job as well. I'm much more passionate with regards to it because I love specific histories and a lot of different histories for that matter, but because I'm also Hellenic myself, it is part of my culture. So the understanding that I have of it, for the most part, I would say is 90% correct. Maybe it's 85% correct, whatever the case may be. Even if it's 80% correct, fuck it, I'll tell you it's 70% correct. I'm going to extend an olive branch so far and say, you know what? Only 70% of the perception that I have of the ancient world, of how I see the ancient world, not just generally the ancient world, because again, sly wording here to try to change it, because if we look at our perception to the ancient world in general, yes, there are cultures that we don't have much understanding of. So again, very sly words that have been chosen here to try and muddy the waters. No, my perception of ancient Hellas, even if it's 70% correct, okay, and 30% of that is incorrect, the use of this argument here is to try to excuse why it's so different to what my perception or what someone like Metatron's perception is. And it's also again muddying the waters because it depends on who you ask. There'll be certain people, for example, that their prejudice or how they view the ancient Hellenic world will be 30% correct. Someone like me and Metatron, I would argue it's more like 90% correct, but whatever. Let's just say it's even as far as 70% correct. When people like me or Metatron or other historians look at that work and say, well, what we know from the ancient Hellenic world is not so much based on cultural prejudice, it's based on findings and historical evidence and data and a lot of study that has been put into this. So what you're saying here is wrong. And if our perception of it is like, it's not like you changed that 30% and you corrected it. It's as if you changed it, you went like 180 degrees and you've changed like 70% of the things that we ourselves have known. You're going completely backwards on this, and you're using this as an excuse to allow yourself to do whatever the hell you want with Hellenic history and rewrite it as you see fit. Okay, so it's an excuse again, because what cultural prejudice? We have the findings. Now, there are certain people again that, if he's referring to those people, maybe they have no idea about ancient Hellas at all, and maybe their perception and understanding of ancient Hellas is that he's only 10 to 15% correct. Okay, good for them. What about the rest of us? The people that are backlashing, so as if he's creating this strawman argument that all the people that are backlashing this are, they're nobodies that don't know anything about the history of, of this work. That's not entirely true now, is it? Because there's a lot of Hellenic people that are backlashing on this. There's a lot of historians, and they're all telling you, what the hell are you doing? People that have actually studied these texts, people that know about the history of this, and so on and so forth. So, again, this whole argument here, it's a sly way for Nolan to try and to excuse himself for taking liberties with the work. But the fact of the matter is that the liberties that are taken, they change it so much and they go in such a different direction in its presentation alone. He's focusing more on the language here. I'll talk about the language, but I'm going to extend that to everything else, because you have to understand that the way that the Hollywood and all these sly vultures are actually trying to communicate is they will pick on a topic that they think is going to be the focal point that they can actually talk about, so they can actually ignore the elephant in the room. And then by extension, they're going to use a lot of phrases that they have in those excuses to try and use them and juxtapose them on everything else as well, without having to talk about it and pretending that they don't know what you're talking about and ignoring it, whilst also trying to force you to actually sit there and talk about something and pretend as if they're like, oh, well, I don't understand why that's a problem. Like, why is race a problem? Well, if race is not a problem, for example, then why don't you leave it in the race that it was? Why are you race swapping it if it's not a problem? So they're using a lot of sly tactics here, and the cultural prejudice, you could argue with regards to how the argument is set up here. It's with regards to the language and how it was spoken, but it extends to everything else as well. And the changes that have been done to the Odyssey here and the liberties taken with regards to how much he has changed the Odyssey show someone that doesn't respect the work and he's trying to find and use excuses, because in Nolan's mind, oh well, there's nothing wrong with what I did. I mean, and these are the reasons why I did it. And he's extrapolating, or he's extending these excuses to other areas as well. So although I'm going to focus on this as much as I can to the language part as well, I will, because subconsciously, and they're definitely using these phrases as well to try and to further their excuses in every other argument with regards to their choices in the film. I'm going to do the same as well. So I'm not going to stay just on the language. I'm going to actually juxtapose this with other choices and decisions that were made with regards to this film as well. Let's go into looking at some of the quotes here and try to analyze what exactly is going on here. First of all, there's a lot of editing it because it's all The fact of the matter is that it's all about quality. It's not elevation because it's old, first of all. Second of all, if you're going to talk about it with regards to the language use itself, that we think that it's speaking more formal, we know what the ancient Hellenic language was like. And yes, it is a work that is, passed down as a form of theater after a point, and book and mythology and so on and so forth, which when you look at this mythology, it is expressed in a certain way. So why do we have to actually apply to it in your manner of, well, it's not exactly as they would talk in the everyday life, when even the work itself, when that was written, was not actually most likely focusing on how they talk in the everyday life, and it was focused much more on being poetic. So you're disrespecting the entire kind of approach of why this work was even, how it was actually put together in the first place. Whilst the second part of this quote, do away with cultural prejudice, we don't have cultural prejudice. And now to add to this, oh Jim, what do you mean there's no prejudice? Look at what the word prejudice means, so you can see how sly they are, because they're using words, and a lot of times they think that they're smart with using these words, and maybe because they think that the mainstream masses are just so stupid that they don't know English themselves. And it could be possible because to a certain large degree, we do know the shadow governments are trying to kind of reduce the educational levels of a lot of people, so when they say things to them, they can mean different meanings from what the actual people actually understand, but subconsciously they are passing the meanings that they actually have on their phrases. So if that made any sense to you, then whoever knows knows. But let's have a look at the word prejudice. The act or state of holding unreasonable, preconceived judgments or convictions. Now, having this as a general kind of understanding of how the work of the Odyssey is working, a cultural prejudice around how we view the ancient world. Now, he might be talking about the language here, but that's a statement that everybody's going to be seeing just that statement itself. It's not going to be seeing everything else. That is ultimately telling us that we have lies, that we don't know actually how it was, not with regards to, how it sounded, as he's trying to do here in this, argument with regards to how the language was, but more so on how the actual world it was as well. Because again, as a statement itself, if you just look at that quote itself, it's nowhere near trying to actually justify just the language. There's no indication that it's talking about just the language at this point. It's talking in a much more general sense and manner, correct? So when you actually have this statement here, you're actually talking about the full perspective that we have with and our view with regards to the ancient world. And what does prejudice mean? The act or state of holding unreasonable, preconceived judgments or convictions. Now the second expression is an adverse judgment or opinion formed unfairly without knowledge of the facts. And third of all, irrational suspicion or hatred of particular social groups such as a race or adherence of a religion. So that goes a little bit more towards the racial kind of side of things. Let's look at the first two, because that's primarily what we're doing here. Is the act instead of holding unreasonable preconceived judgments or convictions, or an adverse judgment or opinion formed unfairly without any knowledge or without the knowledge of the facts. Okay, so are you telling us, Mr. Nolan, are you telling us that we don't know our history? We don't know the facts. We have a cultural prejudice around how we view the ancient world, which means that we don't know what they sounded like when they talk. Is that what you're saying? That we don't know what the armors and the ancient architecture looked like? Because he also comments at some point that, well, we don't know what the armors look like. If you look at it like, it was written at that time. Yes, okay. So if you want to be literal to what it looked like in the Messenian time, guess what? We have findings of what it was like. We'll have findings of what their actual armors were like. We have findings of the architecture, what it was like. I think it's a Agamemnon sword. We have actual findings in museums of what the swords even were like, what the armors were like. We have architecture from the time. We have different kind of art, whether it be in pottery or statues, that shows us what the time was like. So if you want to make that argument that, it was written in 700 BC, and at that time ancient Hellas was a little bit different to what it was when the Trojan War happened, and Homer took liberties to write the Odyssey, a little bit more like what it was during his own period rather than the period of when the actual events of the Trojan War happened. Okay, if that's the case, and you're like, so it's wrong, then what are you substituting it with? Well, you're going to substitute it with what is right, because you're correcting something, right? Therefore, you're going to go to what it actually looked like in that period, and we have findings of what it looked like, correct? But why are you making your own assumption of what it looked like? Now at this point, you're telling me that Homer, which is his story, and he had the right to write it however the hell he wanted to write it, and he put the story together, or the group of people that were Homer, or whatever the case may be, when they put that story together around about 700, 750 BC, just because they, when they first perceived and put that story in written text, might have juxtaposed a little bit more to their time of existence, you're telling me that that gives you the right now to go into any story that was written at a certain period by certain people, and it's their story. It gives you the right now to have a retelling and write it in whichever way you want to interpret it and actually symbolize it and perceive it and present it. It doesn't make sense what you're saying. Either you're going to correct what you are considering to be a wrong and show us the actual historical period, or you're going to respect the actual writer or the people that created the text and show it as they perceived it. To try and create your own correction is as if you're not respecting the work and you're saying, oh, this is something that needs fixing, but you're not actually fixing it because now you're putting something completely different in there, you're creating your own interpretation. So it's not a matter of fixing because you're just Nolan. Nobody gives a shit about you in 100 years. Believe me, like people would forget about you in 100, maybe maximum 200 years. Your work is not going to stand the test of time in terms of 2,700 years. I can bet you on that if you want. You're just Nolan. What is your body of work? Can't even write your own films. You have your brother and you have screenwriters writing those films. You have cinematographers, you have entire art departments and costume departments, a whole bunch of people working for you. Well, what do? You just point the camera and be like, oh, I want this to happen there. You're a director. That's it. Like, don't act so, I mean, being a director is great as well, sure, and there's a lot of talent in there, you gotta know what their vision is and so on and so forth, but you're not gonna compare it to Homer. Okay? Don't think that your work is going to stand the test of time. So you're fixing it with regards to what your interpretation, your perception is. And I would argue at that point, then why even set it in ancient Hellas? Are you trying to show us ancient Hellas or how you view ancient Hellas? And then you just use the excuse, well, it's not exactly how you perceive it anyway. You have prejudice and that's not how the ancient world was. Okay, so you're showing me now something that we know categorically and factually that is even more wrong to what you might be thinking our cultural prejudice might be. It's even more off the mark. So you're using that excuse to create something even further away from what it was like? So it's like you're telling me it's not exactly how you perceive it to be. And especially if you're talking to someone like me where I'm like, again, at least 80 to 90% correct with how I perceive and how I view ancient Hellas because I know my history and my culture. You're going to come and tell me that my perceptions are 100% correct. So what your correction here is what? Going even more off? No, you're just using it as an excuse to do whatever the hell you want. So let's not beat around the bush, but this comment alone, this standpoint alone, is really showing us the heart of the problem, which is they don't respect the work, they don't respect the Odyssey, they want to do whatever the hell they want on it, rewrite it and hijack it, and they're using some excuses, which honestly, if you think about the excuses that they're actually using, they can easily fall flat and you can easily break them apart and show and prove that what you're saying doesn't make any sense. Also, very sneaky use of words, prejudice. Holding unreasonable preconceived judgments or convictions. We know what the ancient Hellenic sounded like. And in fact, there's some writings that the ancient Hellenic, the way it sounded was also kind of like as if it was sung. There was a phonetic melody to it. And we know that because we have a very specific, like, all the little squiggly lines and all the little other lines on top of the letters and underneath the letters that allowed us to understand how certain vowels were pronounced. And once you read it, it has this kind of singing, it does indeed have this singing kind of phonetic melody to it. So we do know for a very factual matter of how the ancient Hellenic sounded in the time, to a very large extent, a very large degree. It also helps the fact that we have a continuation, even though the language has evolved, has changed over time. It is still the basis, it's still the same language after 3,000 years. We still have the continuation with that language, so that helps us as well having modern Hellenic that we can kind of juxtapose again and see the traces and see how all this has evolved over time. So unfairly, an opinion formed unfairly without knowing the knowledge of the facts, or preconceived judgments and convictions that are unreasonable. You're using very sly wording here to try and say us that what our perceptions or what our knowledge is of what is happening in the Odyssey, or what the Odyssey is wrong. So what are you basing the statement on? There's no historical evidence for this conception that you have. I would say that it's your prejudice and it's your perspective that has unreasonable judgments and convictions that are formed unfairly without knowledge of the facts. Isn't it funny, however, though, that hypocrisy is one of the main elements to their own characteristic of how they actually, everything that they do, there's so much hypocrisy and everything. So this kind of shows me right there your hypocrisy when we go on ground zero and we just start this argument to begin with. You have unreasonable judgments or convictions formed unfairly without knowledge of the facts. That's what you're showing us for the people that know and have the knowledge of the facts. And in your hypocrisy, you're trying to switch and turn around and tell us that we don't know what we're talking about. We're not just making shit up. We have the actual findings. So let's move on now to the next part of the quote and see if I can actually, tie some more of the other things that they keep using as a word, as a mixture of words that they constantly use to try and excuse their actions with regards to their decisions on how they're actually portraying the Odyssey and the work itself. Okay, so when we look at the first one, it says Christopher Nolan has discussed his approach of building the world of the Odyssey, insisting his goal was to make it feel very fresh for modern audiences and do away with the cultural prejudices we have when we think about the ancient world. This is a general statement. It's not just about the language. I mean, he focuses on the language, but that's what I was saying before. If you see how sly and how they pussyfoot around the actual meanings, basically at this point here, he's trying to say that, you know what, this is the general kind of outline of what I wanted to do, and I'm going to focus on certain aspects to what he just said here. First of all, he is insisting his goal was to make it feel very fresh for modern audiences. Okay, if you want to make it feel very fresh for modern audiences, then why the hell did you pick it, make it such a brown, dark palette, gray palette, and make it look old and dingy? If you want to make it fresh for modern audiences, where are the colors in the costumes? Where is the ornaments on all the ornate armors and all the highly detailed? You have certain kings, and you look at the things that they have them and the beautiful kind of architecture and the colors in the architecture and the clothes and stuff. Where's all that? If you want to make something look fresh, where's the color? Cultural prejudices, but you are leaning into a cultural prejudice with regards to how you're perceiving the ancient world, as if it's just because it's old and dingy, as if we have a photograph, as if the ancient world is a photograph and over time it has lost its color. That's what the ancient world is like. No, the ancient world was very vibrant, it was full of color. So that's a cultural prejudice that you yourself are actually doubling down on, that all Hollywood cinema has actually been focusing towards. But you want to do away with the cultural prejudice we have when we think about the ancient world. So what this tells me here is that you actually are trying to rewrite history because it's just bullshit. You are very fresh for modern audiences. Let's make this statement clear and understand what we're talking about when we say modern audiences. It's as if he's trying to say that this is the normal. Okay? And that also comes with regards to something else that I had said, that it's how they use the word acceptance as well. You don't accept me, and they keep saying acceptance, acceptance, and then when we accept it, they're trying to pass it on subconsciously so we can actually accept it internally as well, not just accept someone that has a certain preference, for example, but to also have an acceptance within ourselves. And by extension, if you look at that word, what it actually translates to is that the act, or whatever the case is that we are accepting towards, becomes acceptable. So they're trying to make a certain act or something acceptable in our society, even if it isn't. It's the same thing with modern audiences. They're trying to give you the understanding that modern audiences, that this is the model, this is the culture, this is how it's supposed to be. There are no modern audiences if you actually think about it, because if by extension you could argue several things. First of all, you're trying to say that your modern audiences are stupid, and that if you're going to use much more elevated language, that they can't understand it. And second of all, you're trying to tell us and dictate what the modern audiences are trying to see when they actually go and watch a film with mythology, which is not true either, because when somebody wants to go watch Marvel film, they want to see Marvel. They don't want to see a watered down everyday story in normal world and whatever else. They want to see superheroes that can do things that are supernatural. They want to go to see ancient Hellas. They want to see the ancient world. So modern audiences, what exactly does that really tell us? It doesn't tell us anything, because there are a lot of different tastes, a lot of different likes. Some people would want to see renditions. Most people want to see the actual myth of what it would be like. They want to go see a film set in ancient Hellas. What they want to do is they want to be immersed in what ancient Hellas would have looked like. And from the things that we know to a certain degree what it looks like. So the immersion is justified and is also amplified when the work that we actually see reflects that immersion, which isn't created by cultural prejudice, but it's created by actual historical findings. So these are very key sly words here that actually you're either trying to say that the audiences are dumb and they can't understand the work, and so you have to dumb it down, or you're trying to dictate what we're supposed to be looking for in a film, which is political statements. That's why you keep saying modern audiences, political statements, when you're trying to really subconsciously force everybody into the direction, into the mindset that everything that they look at has to be through the perspective, through the lens of a political take, when that's not the case when it comes to studying ancient Hellenic or any kind of ancient culture, because they had a very different a society. We have to understand what that society was like and be immersed in that society and understand what the society was in order for us to actually be able to have an experience of understanding what it was like. For example, I'll give you an example. When you actually sit and you make the focal point of a work in ancient Hellas be about slavery and how bad slavery is, you're like, well, you're changing the focal point of something that we all know to actually juxtapose it in an ancient Hellenic work where in a time where all over the world slavery was considered normal. So by making it for modern audiences, what you're doing is you're taking a political standpoint or social statement to talk about something which was the norm back in the day, which we all know was incorrect or is incorrect overall, and we have evolved past it since then. But you're focusing on that in a time when it was just considered the norm. What are you doing? You're trying to make a statement on the actual world itself as a whole. And that's a completely different work, a line of work that you're doing there. And by doing that, you're taking the focal point away from what the story was. If you wanted to make it for modern audiences and you were actually true to your word, what you would do was, for example, you get rid of slavery in a film. You'd be like, you know what, I'm changing things so I can actually apply it to what we're like today. Well, today we don't accept slavery, so I'm going to get rid of all the slaves and all the slavery and all that stuff in the story. I'm changing that part and I'm making it more into the social norms that we have today, and that's a very general social norm that we have today, that we don't accept slavery, so you get rid of it. Therefore, the parts that are considered to be just the cultural norm of that time, they can be ignored because that's not a statement. Like, the story is set in that time, so it's going to accept those things as norms, and it will talk about whatever it wants the story to be, right? So if you want to focus on the story itself, and you don't want to actually make a statement on all these things, because you shouldn't, you want to focus on the story, then change those to our social norms that we have today. For example, no slavery. Or, if you want to be more immersive and more correct, I would go with this latter version. Should as it was, but don't linger on actually trying to juxtapose and compare it to our time. Like, you're doing a comparison. Therefore, you're not actually showing us what the story was. You're not actually focusing on the story, which the story is talking about something very specific. Either you could change those social norms that we actually we have very different in our time and day today, and you can see them in a very completely different perspective, completely different eye, and change them and form them with our understanding of society today, therefore allowing you to focus on the actual content of the story itself. Or you can just leave it as it was and still focus on the story itself. What you're doing is none of those. You're focusing on something that was considered social norm at the time to make a social statement overall. And I think that one of the biggest reasons why they do that as well is to actually say, you know what, see that? Like, the ancient Hellenes weren't even that great. Oh, it's a social norm that everybody did that back then. Like, where were you? If you want to go down that route, we stopped slavery 2,000 years ago. Where the hell were you? You know, when you were taking black people from Africa and you were actually, putting them in slavery in America. So if you want to juxtapose it, we became much more civilized, because more than 1,000 years before you, we became more. So we were actually in our own. We were occupied by the Ottomans period. Actually, if we're being honest, abolishing slavery was talked about in ancient Athens, in the golden era of Athens, whether it was something that should be abolished or not. We were the first that actually had that census and that standpoint. Africa still practices slavery in a lot of areas. So if you want to sit there and you want to talk about cultures and whatnot, why are you picking on that specific thing which was considered social norm in that time period, and you're actually going into the story of the Odyssey, which has a completely different reason why you would actually choose the story, just so you can actually make a statement on what the ancient Hellenes were. See what I mean? Very sly work. So modern audiences, what it translates to their indoctrinating words to try and give you the understanding of this is what's considered the social norm, of what is the normal understanding of thinking of how we're supposed to perceive certain things, and by extension also reducing the modern audiences to dumb people that don't understand things, and that they need to be led towards a social political statement rather than just actually seeing a story and being immersed in it. It is quite literally a statement that they use when they want to excuse or they want to use key wording, code wording, I would say to a certain degree, for their indoctrination of the messaging that they're trying to pass to you. That's what it means. They've used this phrase hundreds of times by now, and we've seen it in practice on what it means. They're trying to constantly, subconsciously create that state, because when you say a lie enough times, it becomes a truth. That's what they're trying to do with this whole thing, modern audiences. And do away, so they want to get rid of the cultural prejudices, basically our understanding that we have about the ancient world. It's rewriting history with a political statement. That's what this is showing here. That's what his approach to the entire Odyssey is about. Now, if you're starting at that point, how can your work not be a pile of garbage? Again, just to make it simpler, they want to get rid of our historical perception and understanding based on facts and knowledge and findings, so they can change it into a political statement that they want to normalize for all audiences. That's the translation of that, what it means. That's what it means. Very fresh for modern audiences. Do away, get rid of, rewrite, change history, cultural prejudices, a lie of how we perceive the ancient world, even though we have facts and we have findings. So, you're starting at a pretty bad foot here, Nolan. You're starting at a pretty bad foot. Let's not talk about all the other stuff. Let's just respond to these statements here, because they think that they're clever and they're smart in the way that they actually present things. And I'll prove to you how stupid all this is. Literally, how low IQ all this is. But they keep regurgitating the same stuff over and over again in hopes that they have, hopefully, with the poverty they have tried to create all over the world and all the difficulties and money and all that stuff and the lack of education in a lot of cultures and a lot of places, it's a fact, it's a thing that they've been trying to do for many, many years. They're hopefully aiming towards the result of an uneducated populace all around the world. Therefore, when they say their bullshit, it sounds as if it's intelligent, wild comments and takes, and they're fresh and stunning and brave. And it's Nolan. He knows what he's talking about. Who is Nolan anyway? It's someone that Hollywood themselves tried to project as being something that's amazing. So I don't give a shit. The people didn't vote on his actual work. There are a lot of people that are much more talented, with much better stories, with much better directive eye, much more artistic, that we will never know about, because Hollywood will never support them. It's like, well, you're not part of the message, so can't use you, can we? Now, continuing on, it says, Nolan explained why people tend to think historical epics have to sound so formal, and why he went the complete opposite direction of the Odyssey. I'll tell you why people think they need to sound so formal. First of all, it's not that they're sounding formal, it's that they're sounding more like Old English. And because that is more of a bridge of an older time for the English-speaking audience, it gives you a little bit of a better bridge with regards to going to more of a formality back in the day. First of all. Second of all, these are, again, works that are poetry. I mean, we created in ancient Hellas poetry, and we created the tragedies and theater and all that stuff. And believe me, just like today, when you want to have a specific wording or specific language used in those works, there is a reason why they were spoken or they were written in a certain way. So you could argue that yes, maybe even for their current time, the actual wording itself that Homer had used was not precisely 100% with regards to how they would speak every day, which that can be debated in a lot of different directions, a lot of different ways. But ultimately, it's still a part of an epic or a poem, which has to be poetic as well. So for us, straight away, in the English-speaking audience, I'm putting myself in there as well, because I speak English too, the connection to an older dialect of English, which is in its prime to a certain degree a little bit more formal, but it's not formal English. Like, formal English today is not necessarily Old English. So it's a mixture of both. But for the most part, yes, Old English does have a lot of more formalities to it. It does help bridge the gap and create the sense or the setting of the period. Now, if we want to go into completely actually jumping into how they would actually sound, well, look at how the actual work itself was written. And if you look at how the actual work itself was written, and if we look at the actual findings of how the ancient Hellenic language was spoken, like I was saying before, it was a bit more like a phonetic, like they had more of a phonetic melody to it, as if it was sung, as if the language was more as if it was sung. Once you actually realize that, you'll say that, you know what, the most appropriate approach you could actually have is something like Old English, and it helps with the actual representation or the immersion of that world. So when he turns around and says there's a lot of elevating it because it's old, no, it's not elevating it. It's not that it's elevating it to form language. It's actually creating a bridge in terms of time so we can help with the immersion. And why would you want to help with the immersion? Because you're showing ancient Hellas. Otherwise, why don't you just do it in the modern times? Why don't you make it modern soldiers in modern times and change it completely? I'd be okay with that, by the way. You can use whatever dialect and whatever, whatever you want. And if we're going to go down that route, another thing about the English is that it has a certain standards with regards to how it is actually understood and perceived. If you go and you hear Cockneys talk, they have a very different dialect, kind of like a pronunciation of words and whatnot. You're not going to make it in a Cockney dialect or expression. You're not going to go talk as if you have like pronunciations as if you are from New York. You're not going to make it sound as if you're from Philadelphia. You're not going to make it sound as if you're Mexican, as if, you're a Mexican that's in America and you have a Mexican accent trying to speak a language that's not even yours. You understand what I'm saying? Like, there's things of that nature that you're like, what the hell? Which is kind of like what they do in some of the cases with Star Wars. It's as if like, I think it's just like once you look into it, you're going way overboard to actually do a certain amount of representation here. And this is another thing that I want to say before as well with regards to the modern audiences. It's actually trying to say that it's okay for modern audiences, or this is the norm, that audiences should find reflectance in work that represents them in order for them to connect to it. This is division. This is the opposite of unity. When I watch a film that is in Japan, I don't want anything in there from my culture so I can feel connected to the Japanese culture. Future Jim editing in this now. I also want to add to this another point that I wanted to make, that a lot of times you actually want to see a culture how it is and how different it is, because that would also help you see perhaps different perspectives, but also in a lot of cases it will allow you to see the similarities. It'll be like, oh, we do that in my culture or in that culture, and connect the dots and see and have a better resonance with regards to actual social constructs and social norms, you might say, in different societies and how they're actually compared to each other. And sometimes you might actually be able to even find more truths and more unity. That's why I was saying before, uniting different cultures, because you have a better understanding for different cultures, and also you're able to see that, okay, there's certain patterns here with regards to certain ethics that a lot of different cultures seem to adhere to. When I see Japan, I don't want to see Hellas, I want to see Japan. And if anything, that is what creates more unity. But when you don't do that, you're creating dumbed down audiences, division, smaller horizons. You're not expanding the horizons to be able to see more things, to be able to understand more cultures. And I would argue that's the same thing with some people, that they live in one area their entire life, or one location their entire life. That's one of the biggest issues behind something like that as well, is that you have one perception. The more perspectives and perceptions you start to have, the more you start to understand things and you connect more dots, and that, I think, elevates our unity overall. Something that they clearly don't want, and they feed off division. Anyway, I just wanted to add that as I was editing. Back to the video now. And by nurturing that kind of standpoint and that thought, what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a situation where if there isn't, my culture isn't part of the representation on the screen of that other culture that I'm seeing, that I shouldn't feel in some way attached or connected to it or represented in the story itself, because it's a different culture. That creates division. See how they're slowly nurturing more and more racism in all these acts, in the way that they actually perceive it and how they treat it. So the reason why it sounds more formal is not because it's elevated, it's because it's an older language, first of all. Second of all, it's poetry. Third of all, it is actually closer to the ancient Hellenic, which would have been a little bit more formal compared to, these dialects. Fourth of all, you're actually going down the route of creating dialects that are, completely neglecting and negating and contradicting itself with regards to sound like as if you're from Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, or you're from you're British, you have a British accent, or you're Scottish, or, if you're, Mexican with an accent trying to speak English, or whatever the case may be. It's like you're using a lot of the stereotypes or a lot of the accents that we have today that clearly represent a certain part of the world that we are, part of today, that we experience today, that we are aware of. And by that sense, you're destroying the immersion, because now I'm thinking as if I feel as if I'm in New York. Now I'm thinking about your accent rather than what you're actually saying. Now I'm actually feeling as if I'm listening to people that are in California or talking or whatever. Now I feel as if I'm talking to actual English people and talking, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't make any sense of why you would do it, because at that point, if you wanted to do that, what you would do is you'd pick a middle point of how the actual dialect would be, and you try to formalize it to a certain degree so you don't have any actual words that are unformal, which change from region to region. There's a lot of slang in every single region, in every single location, and from city to city, even in America itself, there's a lot of slang words, a lot of way that the language has been actually used and changed and how it's actually expressed, that straight away indicates a certain group of people, culture, or whatever else. And what you're trying to do with one of these immersions is break away from today's time and actually depict it of how it was. So if anything, what you're doing here, my friend Nolan, aside from trying to get rid of do away with the cultural prejudices and rewrite history, as you just clearly showed us, and by saying modern audiences, also proving that you want us to be racist and you want us to be divisive, because we're not allowed to feel connected or represented in a work of art or any other story unless our culture is somehow represented in it. That's what low base level minds are actually thinking about. That's what actual racist people are concerned about. And you're imploring and you're trying to force that direction more and more and more onto the modern audiences, which don't exist, but you're trying to create them and mold them and create the modern audiences to be that way. And you keep saying the same line over and over again until it becomes truth. But at the end of the day, it's very telling why he's using all these excuses, because what he's trying to do is go in the complete opposite direction for the Odyssey. Now, we know that's what you're doing, and you're going in a completely different direction. But let's just analyze the lame excuses that you're actually trying to use in the situation with regards to why you're going into the complete direction of the Odyssey, aside from just rewriting history, which is pretty darn obvious at this point. You're rewriting history and you're retelling history. And you're focusing on different aspects and different parts. It's not part of the story in the first place. It's just not even the Odyssey. And again, I could argue that if you wanted to make it a modern retelling of the Odyssey, then why don't you make it in a modern time? Why do you have to make it ancient Hellas? And again, if you want to make it fresh, why don't you just make it, with all the beautiful colors, instead of going into the actual prejudice that a lot of people have, which is that all ancient Hellenic buildings and statues were just white marble. That is an actual prejudice. Okay, instead of debunking that, you're actually doubling down on it, making everything look even shitter and just look like brown dirt, as if everything's just, as if it's an old sepia photograph. What are you doing here, Nolan? Your excuses, which again fall flat, are very telling of your stance and what you're trying to do. Now, part of the actual statement by the person that is writing this article. My dad is coming home. That line of dialogue has become a lightning rod for online debate about the Odyssey and historical accuracy. No, that is just adding to the debate. That's adding to the debate. So again, you are taking the focus somewhere else, just like everybody else in Hollywood is trying to take the focus somewhere else, and also all the bootlicker reviewers that are trying to praise this work as something that it isn't. You're trying to take the focal point away. No, it's everything in the story and everything that we actually have seen in the trailers and even the race swapping and even the focal point of what we're actually talking about, and debasing and creating such a common tale out of such a symbolical historical piece of work and art that has endured 2,700 years, and making it into the most common, hey, this is the effects of war storyline, which is something that we have seen in almost every war film, modern or otherwise, from Hollywood. And also change the story, which I'm going to talk about the female cast, not all of them, but some of the female cast in this film and their take with regards to female representation, and trying to change the focal point of what we're talking about, what the effects of war is. Like going completely in a different direction of what the story is about. First of all, it's not about war. The whole story of the Odyssey is about the return home. It's not even about war. You want to talk about the effects of the war and all that stuff? Choose something else, do something else, make some of your own stories up. Don't hijack a story whose whole point was to show, for example, in this case, the return home, and it's trying to talk about a very specific kind of tale. And this is Odysseus' tale. That's why it's called the Odyssey. And you're trying to give us the perspective on somebody else's tale of other characters. I'll get into that as well. Besides the fact that they're redirecting the whole point of what this is about in the first place, and as if they're playing stupid, as if they don't know what this is actually about. Continuing to the point, it says this is an adaptation of Homer's ancient Greek epic, the Odyssey. An adaptation. Well, an adaptation means that you're actually trying to show the same work in one way or another, and you're staying true to the actual core skeleton of something. Otherwise, it's not an adaptation. It's just loosely inspired by and you could actually say to a certain degree that it's not even inspired by after a point, because what the hell are they taking besides the character names, and they're changing everything. So an adaptation, again, very sly wording here, is saying what's an adaptation. An adaptation, to actually be an adaptation, it needs to represent the story that you're adapting. You're adapting it for a different kind of medium, okay, but you're adapting the same story. Now when you start changing a whole bunch of stuff in the story, besides the fact that you're actually changing the look of everything and the whole representation and the immersion of the world that you're actually trying to create, you're making it very different to what it actually was, and you're actually trying to tell us that we have cultural prejudice of how we see that world, even though that's not true, and we have historical findings. And then you start changing more and more the focal point of what the story is about. You start changing the whole immersion and everything about it. It's no longer an adaptation, but whatever. And some say, my dad is coming home, perhaps doesn't fit the setting. No, it doesn't. Countering that is the fact that the Odyssey, countering, this is his counterpoint, is a mythic action epic. Do you know what mythic is? It's not a mythic action epic. It's a mythology. Okay, and mythology is ancient Hellenic history. It is much more above and higher than fiction. It's not just fictional folklore. And a lot of that mythology was either actual events that happened and they were represented through symbolism, or the second case of mythology is they're actually trying to describe or explain of certain either spiritual or any other kind of social situation and other deeper meanings through, again, symbolism, which is what the Odyssey was much more about. So when you say myth, I know how you're using it, my friend, and I know how all of Hollywood has been using it and how they've been trying to use it for a lot of years, because they're trying to slowly debase what the word mythic means. Mythology, mythologia, actually is history. That's what the ancient Hellenists called it, history. The difference between actual history and mythology is that this was very symbolic, and they used a lot of symbolisms for the representations. And a lot of those cases, they could be talking about, for example, a certain situation someone would go through in their own personal spiritual ascension, or character traits, or other elements that might happen in their life. And those are also juxtaposed or presented through symbolism and events and monsters and whatnot. All these mythological creatures had a meaning and a purpose behind them. They symbolized something, along with the Hellenic gods and so on and so forth. That's why later on, the tragedies and the theater and all those plays that they were doing, they weren't called mythology. That's the difference between fiction and mythology. Mythology is on a higher level with regards to how much you're supposed to respect it. So I know how Hollywood is using this phrase. A mythic action epic, it's not about action, it's not action epic, you're throwing the word in there, epic, it's mythology. And you should respect what mythology actually means instead of just throwing it in there. And he says, one that features a giant, a one-eyed monster, and enchanting bird women whose irresistible songs lure sailors to their deaths on rocky shores, among other mythical creatures. Let's stop it there. What's your point? So because the actual story that you're basing on and you're trying to do an adaptation of is talking about these elements, that's the story itself, because these might be mythical creatures, or let's just say that they're all symbolisms, we don't adhere to them, we can change whatever the hell we want, or realism is thrown out the window. And then it says, so historical accuracy isn't perhaps the point. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. What is the historical accuracy here? A work that has been historically written a certain way, you historically you adhere to the historical accuracy because it has been represented in that manner for 2,700 years. That's your historical accuracy there, first of all. Second of all, the people and all the locations and imagery that it actually depicts are historical locations, and there are historical characters and beings and people, and we know that for a fact. So historical accuracy isn't the point, really? So you're telling me that because the Lord of the Rings is made up, you know, we can just change the elves into something completely different? Or you know what? Let's just have them talking in slang as if they're Cockneys. Again, let's do that for the Lord of the Rings. We're talking in Cockneys. Why? Well, because Tolkien, he read a certain way, but we don't have to actually go by the way that he would read it. And he wrote, why should we respect the way that the work was written? Why should we respect his dialogue? It's not that he actually wanted it to be represented that specific way. Now, was it? No. Let's just, have them talk like Cockneys. Why not? It's completely irrelevant. It's not a matter of historical accuracy. It's a matter of accuracy to the work. So see how they're trying to bend words around and just change and be like, well, this isn't even historic, which, by the way, again, like I explained what mythology is, you should respect it much more than actual just, some tragedy or some, folklore. But regardless, you're actually throwing the historical word in there so you can lure the attention away from how realistic these symbolisms were in terms of their literal form, which is not the point here. Their point is to actually use the symbolisms and be accurate to that writing and to that text as it represented all those symbolisms. And if you want to talk about historical accuracy, like I said before already, it is a historical work that has existed for 2,700 years. So there is a level of historical accuracy there as well with regards to adapting and respecting a work of art or a work of poem or mythology, whatever the case may be, that has existed for 2,700 years and has pre-existed, my friend, your entire culture and your entire existence. Just because you don't have that, it doesn't give you the right to disrespect other cultures that have it and pretend as if it's nothing important. Completely debunking. I said I wasn't going to talk about the actual statements in the article itself, but I guess I'm going to have to do that as well because it's easily reflecting what Hollywood and what this entire cult is trying to pass on to you, which is what it is. It's a cult. Let's just not make no mistake about it. And then of course we have Tom Holland showing how illiterate he is as well, because we're changing the point, and even the interviewer for making these specific questions, again, changing the focal pivot point into something completely different. And the reason why they did that as well is because they're like, you know what, we've called viewers 100 times over racists over and over again, and this time we realize that we can't say this because they have found our Achilles heel in this story. We have been constantly talking about the representation of cultures. We have been constantly talking about the representation of minorities, this is a culture of a minority, you might say, to a very large extent, a very large degree. We have been talking about cultural appropriation. We've been talking about all these things, and now we're actually race swapping, so they have found the Achilles heel in the situation. So you know what, we're not going to talk about this that much because people are going to catch on and start, putting the facade and our lie to the side and pulling the curtain and realizing how vile we are. So the interviewer himself is going to be like, let's focus on something completely different here. And Holland says, because I wouldn't have even said father back in the day, would I? I would have been Greek. So it's no less correct. Okay, so then do it in Greek if you want to be correct. Hellenic, to be precise. Completely irrelevant. Again, as I said before, the reason why we actually use more formal language is because it actually reaches more of a poetic and also older format, which can be easier for us to create the immersion and the connection with a time period that's a little bit more timeless for us, because Old English or formal English is much more faceless, let's just say, to a certain extent and a certain degree. It doesn't necessarily remind us of ancient England or Old England or some ancient England. Wow. It doesn't necessarily remind us of Old England. It reminds us of a facelessness and a little bit more of an older time epic. Whereas if you're actually using the dialect or the actual words and the actual language format and structure of modern day times, first of all, you're changing the immersion and you're focusing and making it into like a modern day work. So again, it's like saying that's the part where they actually try to piggyback and say modern audiences for this whole part with regards to the language spoken, but by extension it goes into everything else that I said before as well, because it all comes down to their political statement that they're trying to make, and that's why they keep saying modern audiences, a fresh take. No, it is less correct. It is less correct, because in one case it sounds as if I'm listening to someone from New York, completely breaking immersion. In the other case, it's much more faceless, and because it's based on an older dialect of English, being formal as well represents a little bit more of the poetic kind of written texts, but also is closer to what you would say would make the connection of ancient Greek. And it's okay if you're changing the language, because we'll go down that road like, we can just, then we shouldn't say it in any language. No, you can translate it to every language, but how you're actually the wording that you're actually going to use is going to be very different. Like, for example, if I'm reading a book and there's a lot of slang and it's as if like a modern day slang and it's, all cool, hip and, modern day kind of like language used, I expect the translation in any other language, like I do it in English, the translation in any other language to use the equivalent of its actual, modern day times with this slang. And we see that a lot of time also in subtitles and a lot of films, that they actually use equivalent slang to actually make it as if it's, modern day times. Understandable. But if I actually give you and write you a text in English where I'm using Old English, then the translation has to actually adhere to that kind of styling as well. I mean, if you look at The Lord of the Rings, how they're translated into Greek, or if you look at Game of Thrones, how it's translated into Greek, it has a very different style to it than, some other work of art that could have been like, I don't know, some modern day kind of like, detective book. which I've seen translations of those as well. They have much more modern day kind of like, language and lingo and, slang being used that the modern day times might be able to make more sense of. That's completely stupid. That's a completely stupid statement. Now, the next part again is, I already commented on this, cultural prejudice. We don't have a cultural prejudice. You're actually saying that we have a cultural prejudice. Shows that you're debunking historical findings and facts around the ancient world and tend to elevate it because it's old. We don't elevate something because it's old. We're not hipsters like you that we're trying to actually find, some vintage vinyl and actually some vintage bicycle and elevate it because it's old. No. It's elevated to its status that it is because of the actual quality of the work. So again, completely debunked and baseless argument. And then he wants to do away with any of those assumptions that aren't based on anything logical. Oh yes, they are. They're based on the actual fact that this is poetry. It is written in ancient Hellenic. It actually adheres to a very specific style, which is more formal and more poetic. And the fact of the matter is that in your language, you will try to adhere to it and make it more formal, like I gave the example before, rather than actually making it the base as if we're talking in New York and what's up, bro? And we're actually, representing cultures and dialects of today's time, completely ruining the immersion. There's a lot of logic to be had there, all based on actual cultural and, literal findings and knowledge and on text and studies from historians of how the actual language was also even spoken that we know about. So it's based on facts, not based on anything logical. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Nolan? Are you trying to say that we are that stupid that we're almost like, it's as if he thinks that the audiences or the people that are complaining about this are that stupid that they can be manipulated with this clever wording? We can't be manipulated with these lies. I know what the point is, to manipulate the masses with these lies, because the point is not to change the opinion of the intelligent people, the people that know of a certain topic, but they want to change the opinion of the masses. And that's all they care about. And that's why they do this, and they keep fighting back, and they try to keep saying a lie over and over again until it becomes true. And as he adds, present a consistent and accessible world around that feels vital, incredible, and exciting to be in. Vital. Feels vital and credible. So you're trying to get a mythology and make it feel realistic, is what you're trying to say. And at the same time, the word accessible, you're trying to say people are stupid and they don't understand English. Accessible in what way? Or are you trying to say, again, juxtaposition, because we're talking about language here, but all this wording, as I said before, they translate into other decisions as well. Are you trying to say that black people can't resonate with the Odyssey unless they have black people in the story? That's false. You know that that's not true. I don't have a problem with any other culture and being able to resonate with that culture's story and mythology because it's of a different culture. It doesn't bother me. And it doesn't bother black people either. The people that it does bother are racists. People that want to be done with, that's what you're actually trying to say here, Western culture and Western civilization, which the birth and the founding of it is ancient Hellas. Hence, it takes the most attacking in this whole situation. It feels credible and exciting to be in. I'll tell you what would feel more exciting, and I would argue that most people would agree on this. It would feel exciting to actually feel as if I'm being travel, as if I transcend time, and as if you're bringing me and immersing me into a world that doesn't exist today, and I'm actually experiencing mythology. That would be a lot more exciting, because going by that stupidity here, we can actually argue that, well, most films now that are on action epics, we can do away with the wars, we can do with a whole bunch of stuff, all Marvel comics or Superman and all that stuff. We can get rid of all the superpowers and all the, fantastical elements within those works, so it can be more exciting. What are you talking about? That's what makes them exciting. That's the whole point of the mythology in the first place. It doesn't make sense. The arguments are just so half-assed that you can see that they're desperately trying to create excuses. They're just excuses. And then again, he doubles down. When you look at this world, when you look at the ancient world, people tend to view it in weird ways. There's a lot of cultural prejudice. There's a lot of elevating it because it's old. I already talked about this. Don't need to go over it again. And again, if you look at the rest of it, it's just regurgitating the same shit. When you go to the poem, you find something that's really earthly and grounded and accessible. Really earthly and grounded and accessible. So in the one sense that you're saying that it has mythical creatures and we don't need to adhere to all these things. On the other sense that it's very earthly and grounded and accessible. Okay. So if it's accessible, why are you trying to make it even more accessible by actually changing the language and representing it differently? So for me, building the world of film, when I talked to all the actors about it, I said I just want to center it on that and make it feel very fresh for modern audiences. What's the fresh part for the modern audiences? Make the story about the Odyssey, which is about Odysseus, and focus on the females in the Odyssey and their perception of how they experience it, and change the whole point of the story. Is that what your fresh take on all this was? What exactly are you focusing on? And do away with some of those assumptions that aren't based on anything logical. No, they're based on actual findings and actual facts. Cultural prejudices or things over time. They're not cultural prejudices over things over time. We have cultural prejudices like the white marbles, like I said before, and those are corrected. And if anything, over time, whoever studies ancient Hellenic literature, mythology, and the history of it, if anything, the picture becomes clearer and clearer and more accurate. So what you're talking about is bullshit. I mean, things over time, if anything, we get clearer and clearer and better imagery of what that historical, world was like. Stylistically, aesthetically, people tend to look like the Romantic era in art. A lot of paintings where people wear, aren't wearing very much. They've got little bedsheet wrapped around them or whatever it is. You don't even know what it is, okay? And a lot of classical architecture, but by the way, he's read the poem. And a lot of classical architecture, even though that wasn't the architecture of the Messenian period, we went back to what's in the archaeology. No, you didn't, because this is not what was in the archaeology. You're telling me that this shit here is in the archaeology? He looks like a ranger from Robin Hood. What are you talking about? And this guy, he looks like a biker on the right. How did you go back to the amount of bullshit and the lies that they keep spreading? And then what it says here is, and what gaps does that leave? Let's just play devil's advocate that there were too many gaps for them to be able to figure out, oh my God, what did this world look like? Let's just say there were too many gaps. Okay, so why don't you choose the closest representation of what ancient Hellas would look like that we have more information on? You can make it look like classical Hellas, and be like, you know what? This is a work that they've done a lot in the classical age of Hellas, 400 BC, 500 BC. So we'll make it look like that, since we have a lot of references with regards to what it actually looked like to the T, what the language was spoken like, everything. We have a lot of information with regards to it. I mean, it's probably one of the periods that we have the most written information on, like, honestly. So I don't know what you're talking about, gaps. Okay, so if we have gaps, how do you fill in those gaps? By creating your own kind of interpretation of it? By the way, we have actual archaeological findings of what this world looked like. Looking at how do you create a consistent and accessible world around that feels vital, credible, and exciting to be in. How do you create? Well, if you want to be exciting, stick to ancient Hellas and mythology. If you want to be consistent, stick to the writing, to the actual historical findings. And if you want to create around it, you don't have to create around it. It's a retelling, it's an adaptation. Plain and simple. If you want to make an adaptation, change the characters, change the names, and be like, you know what, it's inspired by the Odyssey, completely different characters, completely different location, completely different time and period, whatever. And do whatever the hell you want from then on. Do whatever you want. Nobody's going to tell you anything at that point. Nobody cares. If anything, we might actually like the film. If anything, I'd be okay with him doing a modernized version, or, you know what, make an African story, completely just in Africa, and be like, you know what, this has been inspired, and the basis of this new African tale that we're talking about, which is completely new, the basis for it was the Odyssey. And be like, oh, that's pretty cool. You're using a Hellenic influence, which in some way honors my culture. You're using some of the Hellenic influence to actually retell or create a new story completely in a different region, and also represent those people in that region and their culture, and how that African culture would be. It'd be interesting. I'd be more interested in that. I'd be fine with that, because it's your own story, it's your own tale, and it has been inspired. It has just been loosely inspired or even greatly inspired by the Odyssey. It's a completely different tale. But when you actually give me an adaptation, don't give me this bullshit excuses here. Let's just look at some of the more quotes. Language that has emotional, not intellectual meaning to people. One is not exclusive to the other. So basically what you're saying is people that are either emotional or intelligent, which is again the division between the left and the right and all that shit that they keep saying. That's what you're trying to say here. So basically you're again forcing a narrative with regards to the understanding of people. You can have emotional and intellectual meaning to people. That's where the deeper meanings actually reside half the time. When you have an intellectual meaning, by the way, and it has an emotional depth to it, now that's some of the best shit you can actually manage. So if anything, yeah, you just made it surface level crap. That's what you're pretty much telling us. I was maybe being naive, it might bite me in the ass, but I wanted an earthly narrative. To me it was a no-brainer. Most likely it will bite you in the ass, but I don't think that's the reason why it would fail. Like honestly, if that was the only problem with the film and the architecture was great, the costumes were great, the color grading was great, the action scenes looked great, and, you know, all those things about it looked great. And if you didn't do any, you know, casting changes and all that stuff, and even if you actually had Hellenic people in it, just a couple of casts, I think people would be like, you know what, the dialogue is bad, but you know what, it's actually pretty good for the most part. It wouldn't turn around and bite you in the ass alone. See how they changed the narrative that, you know, this is our main complaint, the film is going to fail because of this. No. The reason why it's going to fail, it's going to bite you in the ass because of all the other kind of, you know, choices that you made in all this and all the other directions, which are at the same time justified with your excuses that you're making for the language. That's exactly the direction that you're going for, and believe me, it's going to bite you in the ass, but for very different reasons, and that's just one extra reason to add on top of it and be like, you know what, this is total trash. To me, it was a no-brainer because you wanted an earthly narrative. Okay, so that's why you made it look like dirt shit as well. What does earthly even mean? It's mythic, so you didn't want it to be mythic. Let's just go into that as well, because that's another thing that they keep saying. Oh, it's earthly. What, realistic? Okay, so why are you even bothering with mythology? You should have gone and done something completely different. To me, that is a no-brainer. Fast track a little bit more of this. He says that he put them in contemporary faces. We don't want to go see today's modern time in a theater of a rendition of what the Odyssey is. People want to go see the Odyssey. People want to see ancient Hellas. People want to be immersed in that setting. Okay, when I want to watch The Last Samurai, now of course in The Last Samurai, the character, the book that I was actually reading, it does have the war where, you know, you have English, Americans, whatever they were, that actually was part of the story. But aside from that, the actual setting was Japan, and it was about an immersion in Japan. And whatever other tale you do in a specific country in a specific time period, unless the cultures that you're actually representing are part of that time period, or that part of that story, you don't represent them, because I want to be immersed in that story. And then here's the last funny part on this. These are the mythological features, iconic in some ways. And I wanted to cast a big get finest bunch of actors here, okay? And because, as the LA Times put it, their familiar faces would help a modern audience feel at home in an ancient story. You're calling people stupid. Again, you're using the argument modern audiences. I already explained before what exactly modern audiences actually means. And here's my response to one of the creators that actually had a pretty good take on the Odyssey. Modern audience, the Trojan Horse phrase of a lie that they say over and over again until it becomes true. What it means, we are subconsciously programming the idea of what modern audience is as a means to make it about political statements and force indoctrination and narratives that we claim are modern, as a means to forcefully normalize this stance. That's what it means. That's what it means whenever you hear the modern audience. That's what it really means. First of all. Second of all, you want their familiar faces to help this modern audience feel at home in an ancient story. This modern audience is the narrative that you're running. So basically you're saying that you're racist and you don't feel familiar in an ancient story, which, by the way, because it's ancient, by the way, it's not that complicated. We have much more complicated ideas and much more complicated narratives and stories now, you know, with science fiction and all that stuff. We're on a whole different so you're basically practically telling people that you're stupid and you're also racist. And because you're stupid and racist, we want to give you an audience that you're going to be able to feel at home with. Like, it doesn't make any sense, you know what I mean? It's, if anything, this is showing that they're trying to indoctrinate the whole idea of racism, because it's all about race to them. I mean, if it doesn't matter, then why do it? Why change it? You know, another small, parenthesis here. John Campia went along to say that he was comparing Black Panther to Troy, and he was saying that, the race and the color and all that stuff doesn't really matter on the character's progression and narrative. And he was saying that Black Panther was an exception because that was part of his whole story. No, it wasn't an exception. That is the rule, even for Black Panther and Helen of Troy and for all these characters, you know what I mean? By extension, what they're really saying is that, you know what, if you're a minority, then you have a character, then you have a narrative, and your identity is tied to some of those characteristics of where you come from and whatnot. But if you're white, what they're trying to say is that we don't have any character. Okay, so let's read between the lines here. Okay, Helen of Troy being Spartan was of utmost significance in the whole story. But I digress. And then he responds to the comment, Batman helmets and sailed in Viking ships. And this is how sly they are and how they switch it around. First of all, he says, we have very fragmented archaeological records. Not true. And then he insists that agricultural appearance in the movie is feasible. Also not true. The design of it is not true. We have actual armor to know what it actually looks like in that period. And what he focuses on is the black part, black bronze. Do you not see the whole shape? You could have made it black, but it could have at least looked Hellenic. Here is the other part that I mentioned before, that in the manner of people living in Homer's time, roughly 400 to 500 years after the collapse of the last Bronze Age. So there's a pretty strong case there for portraying things the way it was as the first ones that received the story. Yes, it is, it is, like I said at the beginning of this, possible that because they wrote it in, more classical Greece, that the portrayal of it was more compared, according to classical Greece. It's their story, though. What gives you the right, that is not your story, to go and hijack somebody else's story and say, well, because you did it, that you created the story, I can do it as well now that I'm adapting the story. It doesn't hold any water. And if you want to make any changes there, from the records that we actually do have, you can make it and change it more to look like the ancient times. And now here we have the other part on this, which says, some complain about the physics at play in Interstellar. For Interstellar, you're looking at what is the best speculation in the future. When you're looking at the ancient past, it's actually the same thing. What is the best speculation of how I can use it to create a world, he said. You don't have any speculation. You said it yourself, like he's contradicting himself. It's actually the same thing, yes. Actually, no, I just realized what he was saying, that because he's using speculation to see what the future is like, he's actually using speculation to go to the past. I thought that he meant that you don't use speculation because it's the same thing, as in, it's actually the same thing, that the past is the same thing, so you don't need to speculate anything. Oh my god. This guy is completely bending over backwards, that even I, reading this, gave him like an olive branch that he could, like, it could have honestly meant it's actually the same thing, that the past is the same thing, so you don't need to have any speculation there. But he couldn't even say that. He's totally contradicting himself. No, my friend, we know what the past was like. We have a lot of information, and if anything, we're adding more and more findings and information to that historical record. Okay, so coming around and saying, let's speculate what it's like, that's not an adaptation, that's barely even an interpretation. It's, if anything, just mildly inspired by it. And you're taking the story into a completely different direction, As I heard, for example, that we're seeing this whole story through the lens and the eyes of the actual female character. So, like, I'm seeing Spider-Man's story through the eyes of Aunt May. That's pretty much what they're saying at this point, Or I'm seeing Iron Man through the eyes of Pepper, Or I don't know what other kind of argument can we make here. I'm seeing the story of Aragorn at this point now through the eyes of Arwen. Like, what are you talking about here? That's not the story that we signed up for. You know what I mean? And then we have the sirens as well, which I heard, like the scene of the sirens, as if it's an existential kind of crisis that he's going through at that point, as if he's got a whole bunch of feminists, pointing at him and screaming at him, when it's supposed to be the completely opposite thing. It's seductive, but God forbid they have any female, even though they're birds, they have any females, if any feminine kind of representation try to seduce a man, you know what I mean? Because masculinity toxic, okay? Hopefully they enjoy the film, even if they don't agree with everything. I extended an olive branch and some videos back on saying maybe we are wrong, but the more it's coming out, it's like, bro, you can't hide around this. The sets look bad, the armors look bad, the color grading looks bad, the casting looks bad, even those that are white. The whole thing just looks bad. The story is focused on a completely different point. You're not focusing on the story of the Odyssey. You're changing what the narrative is about. You're making it about defying the gods. And as one of the reviewers said, it's his defense of his hubris towards the gods, where it's supposed to be the opposite. He's supposed to be humbling himself before the gods. I've explained this in another video, why they're attacking the gods now again with regards to ancient Hellas. On a very large video where I'm actually doing making of videos for one of the games that I'm designing, and it's also talk over while I'm designing, no less, a game based in ancient Hellas. You see all this and you're like, look at the images here, you know what I mean? The armors look bad. It's all brown. Everything about it is just brown. You know what I mean? They just think that everything is brown and gold in antiquity. You know what I mean? This is our Odysseus. Are you kidding me? And that's Athena. That looks like a hermit and a beggar. It's not the black that people are complaining about. Can you see what the design is like? Look at the eyes. Look at the way the whole thing has been designed. And there's another screenshot, there's another shot that I have somewhere with the white helmets that look like cardboard, and again I have that round thing on the eyes. It's like you're making them look like owls. The helmet looks as if Transformers had sex with Batman. You know what I mean? As one of the AI videos was putting it. Yeah, okay. Here we have an American, a Spaniard, an American, a Latino, and an Indian. Very ancient Hellenic. Also, completely doesn't look like anything like in the Trojan times, but whatever. But probably one of the less, vile costumes in the entire film. Like, after we've seen all the other stuff, like the giants and what they've done to, like, this is probably the least vile of all the costumes. Bad CGI here as well. And no, it's not based on the translation by Robert Fagles. It's based on the translation of Emily Wilson. I'm going to finish up with this. Moana creatives are working closely to honor Polynesian culture and traditions, and why representation matters in the live action film. Okay, so in all other stories, representation matters, and being working closely to honor a culture and a tradition matters when it comes to the cultures that you decide matter. But I guess it doesn't matter for ancient Hellas. And I'll leave it there. You can't make these things up for yourself, guys. Like, who is the real racist here? I mean, if it doesn't matter, keep the characters as they are. You're making this about race consistently and constantly. And the whole point of what this is about in the end is just race. For you, it's all about race. That's why you're trying to add it in there. That's what you're trying to change it. It's not that you don't care. It's not that it's, it doesn't matter, so we just do whatever. No. You do care. That's why you're race swapping. Stop telling us that we're the ones that care when we're actually defending the historical accuracy of a piece of work. And then start coming up with all these weird excuses to try and weasel your way around it. It's like, well, that's not how they really talked back in the day. Yes, but now you're acting like a little child that doesn't understand the basics, and you're just trying to, create strawman arguments and point the finger here and point the finger there so you can actually create a narrative. Nobody said it has to sound like ancient Hellenic, But as I explained before, the language used does help for a certain bridge and a certain gap, and it also does elevate the actual formality of the words, because, by the way, let's not forget that it is an epic poem. So, and by representing it with contemporary dialect, it's as if you're ruining the immersion. Again, I went through all of this already. Is Nolan's Odyssey the gift that's going to keep on giving? Are we going to keep going on about this for a long time to come after the film has actually been finished? It's possible, the way that it's going. It's very possible. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, peace be with you.